Welcome to today's Intel Focus, the review series. We're doing a deep dive into the Syrian civil war, specifically the surprising resurgence of fighting. A lot of people thought this conflict was basically over.
Yeah, I think a lot of us were caught a bit off guard. I mean, for years, things had been relatively quiet. But this recent rebel offensive, well, it's really changed things. It raises some serious questions about what happens next in Syria and, what it means for stability in the whole region.
Yeah, no question about that. And this rebel offensive, well, they've managed to take a lot of territory, most notably Aleppo, Syria's largest city.
The fall of Aleppo, it's a major blow to the Syrian government, to Assad.
Hmm.
Remember, he retook Aleppo in 2016 after years of just brutal fighting. It was a big victory for him at the time. I think a lot of people saw it as a sign that his regime was going to survive. But for the rebels to retake it so quickly, I mean, just 4 days, it surprised a lot of people, around the world.
It definitely did. What the sources we're looking at today actually includes an interview with Golgotha Hamdo. He's a resident of Aleppo and an opposition activist. He went back to Aleppo after 8 years of living in exile. His story really puts a human face on everything that's happening.
You're right. It's easy to get lost in the big picture, the geopolitics of it all. But Hamdo's story, it's a reminder that there are real people whose lives are being completely upended by this war. Going back to Aleppo, a place he never thought he'd see again. It's pretty powerful.
Yeah, for sure. It makes you wonder, how could Assad have been caught so off guard? What allowed this rebel coalition to make such progress so quickly?
Well, part of it, I think, has to do with Assad's allies, Russia and Hezbollah. They've got other things going on right now. Russia, obviously, is heavily involved in the war in Ukraine. That's stretching them pretty thin militarily. And Hezbollah, well, they're facing their own conflict with Israel. Plus, they've lost some important leaders. It's weakened them. They just can't give Assad the same level of support that they used to.
So Assad's usual support system, it's not what it once was. But then again, we're also seeing reports that Iranian-backed militias are moving into Syria. It seems like Iran, they see Syria as a key part of their plans in the region. They're stepping in to help Assad.
Exactly. While Russia and Hezbollah are, to some extent, sidelined, Iran seems determined to keep Assad in power. Their involvement adds, yet another layer of complexity to this already complicated situation. And, we also have to talk about who these rebels are. The rebel coalition, they're mostly led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. And that's a problem for the West, because HTS has ties to al-Qaeda.
Yeah, that's a really big issue for the U.S. and other Western governments. I mean, the U.S. considers HTS a terrorist organization, so engaging with them is really problematic.
No question. It's a tough spot. Now, HTS has been trying to distance itself from al-Qaeda. They've been talking about inclusivity, tolerance towards minorities, trying to change their image, really.
Right, and we have this piece from Vox. They go into detail about all the complexities of HTS. The fact that they're trying to present themselves as more moderate, but a lot of people aren't buying it,
Right.
including the Biden administration and countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia.
It puts the West in a difficult position. A weaker Assad regime might actually be in their interest. But supporting a group like HTS, even if they are trying to moderate their image, it's risky. There are also concerns about how the Syrian Kurds are reacting to all of this, specifically the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF. They control territory in northeastern Syria. They're worried about HTS getting stronger.
And they have good reason to be worried. I mean, the SDF has been a key U.S. ally in the fight against ISIS. Now they have to contend with this new threat from HTS. And of course, they're concerned about what might happen to the Kurdish population in Aleppo.
It's a really complicated situation because Turkey,
Yeah.
a NATO ally, by the way, they view the SDF as an extension of the PKK, which is a Kurdish group that Turkey considers a terrorist organization.
So you've got Turkey, a U.S. ally, supporting the Syrian National Army, which is part of the rebel coalition. So they're indirectly helping a group that includes HTS. And the U.S. considers HTS a terrorist organization.
It shows just how complicated this all is. You've got all these different alliances, conflicting interests. One side makes a move and it leads to all these unintended consequences. It's what makes this conflict so difficult to understand, let alone predict. And we can't forget about what happened in Hama, Syria's fourth largest city. It was a major transportation hub connecting different parts of the country.
Hama has a lot of historical significance, too. I mean, it was the site of that horrific massacre back in 1982 when Hafez al-Assad, the Shah's father, brutally put down an uprising. Thousands of people were killed. So the city falling again, it brings up those memories. And it makes people wonder if that kind of violence could happen again.
It's no doubt. And strategically, the fall of Hama is a big problem for Assad. It weakens his control over the country even more. His forces were already spread thin, and they ended up retreating from Hama, saying they needed to protect civilians. But it shows how much pressure his regime is under right now.
Yeah, and you have to think about the international community. Yeah. A lot of countries were starting to move toward normalizing relations with Assad. Now this happens. What are they going to do?
The U.S. is in a tough spot, that's for sure. The Biden administration has been calling for de-escalation, but, they haven't actually done anything concrete. They want to oppose Assad, but they also don't want to support these rebels, especially with HTS being part of the coalition. It's a tough balancing act.
Well, there's definitely concern about HTS, their ideology. What if the whole rebel coalition becomes even more radical? But some people, some Syrian opposition activists, they think the U.S. should see this as a good thing.
Right, like Muaz Mustafa. He's with the Syrian Emergency Task Force. He argues that the U.S. should be happy about this offensive. He says the Syrians are basically fighting America's enemies, Russia, Iran, Assad. He thinks the U.S. should just let them fight.
That's one way to look at it. But, it doesn't really address the concerns about HTS. And what if this offensive just leads to more violence, more instability? It's not that simple.
It really isn't. And then there's the whole issue of the U.S. election coming up. Who knows what U.S. policy on Syria will look like a year from now?
It's hard to say. During his first term, Trump talked about pulling U.S. troops out of Syria. But in the end, he didn't do it. His advisors talked him out of it. But then he appoints Tulsi Gabbard as his director of national intelligence. And that suggests maybe a change in policy.
Yeah, Gabbard has met with Assad. And she's been pretty critical of the Syrian opposition. Her views on Syria are definitely different from a lot of people in, the foreign policy establishment. Now, Trump tends to be pretty hawkish on Iran, so maybe that means he'll be more confrontational with Assad's regime. But with Trump, it's always hard to say what he'll do.
That's true. He's unpredictable. One thing we do know is that this rebel offensive has really shaken things up. It's a volatile situation now. And what happens in Syria, it doesn't stay in Syria. It has an impact beyond its borders. One thing we need to think about are the civilians. Tens of thousands of people have been forced from their homes because of the fighting.
It's a humanitarian disaster, and this is on top of the millions who are already displaced because of the war. If this fighting keeps going, it's only going to get worse. The international community needs to step up and provide more aid, more support.
They really do. And there's the risk that this conflict could spread to neighboring countries, especially with Turkey involved. Turkey's intervened in Syria before, and they have a very tense relationship with the Kurds. Their role in this whole thing is really worrying.
And then there's ISIS. We can't forget about them. They could take advantage of all this chaos and instability, try to regroup and rebuild. Nobody wants to see ISIS make a comeback. But as long as the Syrian civil war goes on, it's a possibility, a dangerous one.
Definitely. So where do we go from here? What are the possible outcomes?
It's really hard to say for sure. There are a few different scenarios. In the short term, well, it's possible the offensive runs out of steam and we go back to a stalemate, like a frozen conflict again.
But a frozen conflict isn't a solution. Not really. It just means the suffering continues, and Syria stays vulnerable, ripe for more instability down the road.
Exactly. Now, another possibility. What if the rebels actually win? What if they manage to overthrow Assad? It would be a huge shift in power. But it's hard to say what would happen after that.
You've got to remember, this rebel coalition, it's not exactly a unified front. They've got different ideologies, different goals. If they took control of Syria, could they actually govern it? Could they keep things from falling apart?
Big questions. And then there's the question of how Russia and Iran would react if Assad was gone. Would they get even more involved? Could it trigger a bigger regional war? It's scary to think about.
Yeah, it has the potential to escalate very quickly. Another possibility, even though it seems unlikely right now, is a negotiated settlement. But everyone's so dug in, they don't trust each other. It would take a serious effort from the international community to get everyone to the table. And even then, who knows if it would work?
The Syrian civil war, it's become a proxy war. All these regional and global powers are involved. That's why it's so hard to see a peaceful solution anytime soon.
It's a tragedy. The Syrian people have been through so much, and it doesn't seem like it's going to end anytime soon. The world can't just ignore what's happening.
Absolutely. We need to do everything we can to help the Syrian people, and we need to work toward a peaceful resolution. The stakes are just too high to look away.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. The Syrian civil war, it's complicated. So many different conflicts all tangled up together, and it affects the whole world, really.
Yeah, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by it all, the scale of it, and all the different groups and countries involved.
Right, exactly. But if we try to, break it down a little, we can see some key things that are happening here. I think the most surprising thing is that the fighting has flared up again like this.
Yeah, for sure. Everyone thought this was a frozen conflict, done and dusted. But it wasn't, was it? This rebel offensive shows that there were still a lot of unresolved issues just below the surface. And even when a war fades from the headlines, those issues, well, they don't just go away.
No, they don't. They can come back with a vengeance, like we saw in Aleppo and
Yeah.
Hama, the Syrian civil war. It's hard to predict.
That's one thing that's been true throughout this whole conflict. Things never seem to go the way anyone expects. It's this mix of local issues, regional powers struggling for control, and international interests. It's a stage where everyone is playing their own game.
And as we've been talking about, you've got these outside powers. Russia, Iran, Turkey, the United States, they all have their own agendas. That makes things even more unpredictable.
You just never know how things are going to play out. One side thinks they've got the upper hand, and suddenly everything changes. We've seen it happen over and over again in Syria. It shows how important it is to stay informed, to really think critically about what we're hearing.
Exactly. We need to be careful about those simple narratives. The ones that try to explain everything in black and white terms. There are no easy answers here. The situation in Syria is just too complex.
It really is. And we have to remember the human cost of all of this. The Syrian people have been living through this war for over a decade. The displacement, the suffering, it's unimaginable.
Millions of people have had to flee their homes. They're living as refugees in other countries or displaced within Syria itself. The humanitarian crisis is massive, and the international community, they have to do more, provide more aid, more support.
They absolutely do. We can't forget about the Syrian people. We can't let them become just another statistic, another casualty of geopolitics.
Right. Their stories, their struggles, they have to be front and center. And it's important to understand that what happens in Syria, it affects the whole world. This conflict, it's contributed to the rise of extremism. It's fueled the global refugee crisis. It's even strained relationships between major powers.
This war could destabilize the whole region. Other countries could get dragged in. It's a reminder that we're all connected. What happens in one part of the world matters everywhere.
So what happens next? What does the future hold for Syria?
Well, it's impossible to say for sure, especially in a situation like this. But we know this much. The Syrian civil war is not over. This recent rebel offensive, it's a new chapter, and it's probably going to be just as brutal and chaotic as the ones that came before.
The international community has a choice to make. Do they keep putting their own interests first, which just keeps the conflict going, and the Syrian people keep suffering? Or do they work together to find a political solution, even though that's going to be really difficult?
It's not clear what's going to happen, but the stakes are high. This war in Syria, it's a test of our humanity, really. It demands our attention, our empathy, our commitment to finding peace.
We hope this deep dive is giving you a better understanding of what's going on in Syria. It's a complicated situation, a tragic one. We encourage you to keep learning about it, seek out different perspectives, and advocate for a just and peaceful solution for the people of Syria. They deserve it.